Hey all, this is David Ducker coming back at you, and today I'm going to be talking about ogres, how I do ogres in my game. Ogres are probably my third favorite race. I'm a huge fan of the ogres, and as I could start off by talking about their history. So, in my game, in the mythological past, uh, dragons ruled over the earth, and they kept giants as their slaves. Eventually, the giants rose up, overthrew the dragons, and started to establish their own kingdoms. These kingdoms, over time, have developed into the common races. So, into dwarfs, into elves, into humans, and the one that's still very close to their roots are ogres. So ogres are descended from giants, and they are the giants typically who dwelt in the frozen north, or the extreme north of a temperate region. So ogres in my game are kind of a nomadic herding society. They're to a degree based on Hussites and also on Siberian nomads in real-world history. So they are the great masters of the northern beasts of muskox, of elk, reindeer, woolly mammoths, and mastodons and woolly rhinoceri as well. So they have long ago tamed and started breeding these creatures and used them to pull their enormous wagons behind them, and they follow along with their herds in these wagons. Ogres are tremendously lazy civilization. They're tremendously lazy people. So they just basically ride along in the wagon. The wagon is pulled along by some of the herd, and the rest of the herd can kind of run free and wander as they like. And whenever the ogres need to slaughter one, they do so. They try to use every part of the animal when they take it, and then they get back in the wagon and they continue on. For them, it's a tremendously easy existence, and that's the way they like it. They have trained some of these beasts to actually be ridden, not just to pull a wagon, but to be ridden. So in combat, cavalry is definitely their preferred method. Riding on top of woolly rhinoceri, on top of mastodons, on top of muskox, if they can get a muskox to bear their weight. In terms of appearance, ogres stand anywhere between 8 and 12 feet tall. So they're very large, and they tend towards fat. They're incredibly fat humanoid creature. I believe that's ectomorphic, if I'm recalling correctly. So very large, very wide, very rotund. They consider it a great show of their masculinity and their manliness, just to have an enormous gut. The bigger they are, the higher in status they are. If they ever get in a formalized contest, a fight with each other, a duel, it's very much like a sumo wrestling contest or Mongolian belt wrestling, if anyone's familiar with that. So it's a belt wrestling style where the first one to get thrown to the ground is the loser. And they wear heavy belts, and you're allowed to grip your opponent's belt as you try to throw him down. So in this type of contest, weight and girth do play a huge factor, which is why they've selected it as their signature martial art, if you can call it that. Their skin tends towards a greenish hue, and they'll typically they'll have large noses. They're kind of rounded at the end. In terms of like the Norwegian troll, the mythological Scandinavian troll, that kind of big floppy nose, tend towards larger ears as well. So it's a green skin, blunt teeth, and they'll typically have horns on their head as well. And these horns can range quite significantly. They could have a single curved horn like a rhinoceros. They could have sweeping goat horns, or curled ram horns, or split kind of muskox or oxen type horn as well. Or even bull horns, tiny bull horns at the top of their head. They tend to have thick, shaggy hair as well. Many of them do grow beards, although it's not universal that they have beards. Some of them have slanted eyes as well, although not all of them. It's maybe a 50-50 split. So that's basically what their appearance is. Big, fat, hairy, with horns and big noses. And as I said, they're incredibly lazy. They follow their herds. The wagons that they ride in are typically made of the bones of their charges. Although many of them do have wooden wagons as well, and the wheels will pretty much universally be made of wood, very often ringed in iron. So they spend the summer months in these separate caravans, in their small clans or tribal groupings, just following their herds, living this idyllic life to an ogre. It's very relaxing, very slow-paced. Their clothing, of course, is made from the fur and hide of their charges, of their mounts. But during the winter, they tend to congregate at a few cities. There are very few ogre cities, but they are there. And during the winter, the ogres will head towards their nearest city, kind of bed down there for the harshest winter months. And this is their opportunity to trade in their produce. So they'll trade all the meat they've salted. They'll trade the fur they've managed to collect. And this is also when they'll kill any of the excess members of their herd. So, if there's a long winter, it might be more economical to slaughter half of their herd rather than feed the entire herd for the entire winter. So they'll slaughter half, sell that, and feed the remainder on the proceeds. So that's their big, market trading season. They'll have great festivals, drinking contests, wrestling contests. They'll get hooked up with mates during the winter in their cities from other traveling caravans. Any actual war between ogres is very, very rare. They don't really war among each other. They're just too lazy. They'll wrestle each other in personal disputes, but they don't really have enough rivalries or bad blood between each other to ever war against each other. So they are very peaceful in that respect. Now what they will do is, in the cities, some ogres live in the cities year-round. The cities are their centers of industry and production, and they rely very, very, very heavily on slaves. So they'll collect slaves from all over and put them to work there, building the cities and creating goods for the ogres. So if they take dwarven slaves, they'll eventually they'll find their way to the ogre city near the mountains. They'll put them to work as miners and blacksmiths. If they take elven slaves, they could put them to work creating textiles and wine for the ogres. If they take human slaves, of course, they're good for pretty much everything. They can put them to work, especially lumbering and fishing, some agriculture as well. Orcs usually don't allow themselves to be taken as slaves. If they do, ogres will put them to work as soldiers, bodyguards, gladiators, other such pursuits, lumberjacks, other such pursuits that orcs can actually manage to do. It's fairly rare for goblins to become slaves, even among their own people, and ogres can't really take goblins captive very easily. Most of their dwarven slaves they get from goblins, actually. And for goblins, most of their elven and human slaves they get from ogres. There's a big slave trade between the ogres and the goblins. They're very closely aligned. So the ogre cities are actually built by the slaves. So they're a complete mishmash of architectural styles. And the ogres themselves, don't really have any architectural style or textiles that's unique to their culture. They pretty much steal everyone else's culture, and for themselves, they're somewhat more barbaric. They wear furs. They're nomads. There's not a lot of culture there. They do follow their own religion, and they worship what's the Great Maw, which is a god of gluttony and idolatry and cruelty and laziness and sloth. I've taken this from the Warhammer fantasy setting. You'll see I've taken a lot of my ogres from there, although I've added quite a bit of my own, and still one from other sources as well. Certainly, you could have the ogres worshipping Sethagwa from the Cthulhu mythos. That would be a perfect fit. If you're using classical mythology, you could have them worshipping probably the Titans if you're using Greek. Or if you're using Norse mythology, I would plug them in with Thrym or Surtur, one of the giantish deities, or the Jotun as they're called. But the Great Maw is kind of, that's a Warhammer deity. It fits them perfectly. That's what they worship in Warhammer. One cultural trait they do have is cooking. Ogres love to eat, and they love to cook. So ogres as chefs, they're just the greatest chefs. And, they'll work very hard to steal culinary traits from all the other races and kind of incorporate them into each other. Fusion cooking in a fantasy game. Their magical style is, again, I'm stealing this from Warhammer. It's called gut magic, and it's entirely based on eating material components and drinking potions. So it's a very interesting take, almost like an alchemist in that respect. So, for example, eating hot peppers might give them a flame breath. Or eating, some troll fat. Trolls regenerate. So if you eat troll fat, then you can regenerate for a certain period. Or you can have a healing potion that work that way. So a lot of great opportunity for interesting magic with their gut magic style. But getting back to the slaves, as ogres are wont to do. So they take slaves captive, and when the slave population starts to diminish, when they feel there's a need for slaves in their community, they'll wait till the next winter. And when all of the nomadic ogres have come together into the city, they'll gather in a great host, and they'll ride south into the human lands and go on a great slave-taking campaign. They'll often enlist with goblins, so the goblins will send an army as well to assist the ogres, and they'll basically split the slaves they take. And in battle, the ogres use a logger or a wagon fort, which is something I'm taking from Hussite history and real-world history. So look that up, Wagon Fort on Google. But basically, they'll have their beasts pulling wagons. The wagons have a higher wall on one side than the other, and it's crenellated, like a castle wall. And when they come up onto a human settlement, they'll of course raid it. But during the night, or when they see the enemy coming, if a human army is coming, they'll draw the wagon up into a circle. All of the wagons will draw up into a great circle, and it'll tighten up until all of the beasts head into the middle, and they pull the wagons all back to back. So the front of one wagon is touching the back of the next, forming a fort. And that wall, as I said, is higher than the inside wall. It's crenellated, and it'll have a drop-down section. So between the big solid wheels, it'll drop down, and I'll block that off as well. There will be a small section in the front and back, so a circle, the front and back will have openings that they'll put chains across. Now the ogres will stand all on the wagons with long pikes and spears. So anyone charging at this wagon fort is going to get spears right into their hide. They'll have archers behind that firing out, and right in the middle they're going to have all of their offensive cavalry. So ogres on woolly mammoths, ogres on woolly rhinos, and when they want to, they can drop the chain, have their cavalry ride out, and attack. So it's kind of a mobile fortress, extremely difficult to attack, as real-world history will teach you, without siege engines. And of course, siege engines take so long to drag out and set up that the ogre cavalry can just ride out and smash that. So this is their battle tactic. It's extremely effective battle tactics, and it's kind of fortunate that ogres are so lazy, or else they could possibly conquer humanity using these tactics. But they'll only launch these raids when they're low on slaves. They'll head out. They'll gather up as many slaves as they can or they need, splitting them with the goblins, of course. And then they'll return back home. And the cities have been repopulated with slaves. The ogres have had a chance to prove themselves in battle so that they can impress females with stories of their bravery and their enormous courage and their massive guts will be covered with scars, which they wear like badges of honor. So that's how they conduct their warfare, and that's how they gather most of their slaves, which the cities rely upon for all the work. Ogres are the ruling class. Everyone else in an ogre city is slaves. It does make them prone to slave uprisings, but in general it works fairly well for the ogres. So let's see. Let's see what I've forgotten. So I talked about food, shelter. I talked a little bit about clothing. Talked about military, religion, magic. So let's talk a little bit about their government. So in the wagon, in the nomadic kind of tribal wagon caravans, that's generally patriarchal. The oldest ogre there, he's the leader. It's usually just a family group. So it's just, you're traveling with your family, and your grandpappy, he's the patriarch of the family. In the cities, though, it's a little bit more complicated, where the ogres will engage in some politicking against each other, but generally it's just the richest ogre is going to be the leader. There will be a council, kind of a council of merchants, who will be leading the ogre cities, making important decisions together, and it's all very I don't know if you want to call it meritocratic or kleptocratic, but the richest ogres tend to rule and have more political power. So whoever owns the most slaves, and whoever's got the most skilled slaves, whoever's got the most resources, that's generally the ruler, but they do rule in a council together. So as I said, ogres amongst themselves, amongst other ogres, are very peaceful. They don't really steal from each other too much. They don't really fight each other too much. But they do kind of jostle for position just by being better than the others. And if it comes to a physical conflict, like I said, they'll resort to wrestling, just that belt wrestling style. Ogre wrestling. Ogre wrestling, perhaps I will call it. But I think that's pretty much it from my take on ogres. So I'd love to hear how you do ogres and what you think of this version of them. Feel free to steal this as well. All these ideas, steal them as you like, because I've stolen bits and pieces of them, so they're not really my ideas anyway, for the most part. But I'm going to sign off now, and I look forward to hitting up some more race videos. Already done goblins, ogres, undines, and Oreads at this point, so look forward to some more. Cheers.